The distant stars gleamed faintly in the black sea above, a slow swirl of cosmic dust lit by the flicker of dying suns. But down on the surface of Kale's Rock, the stars felt much, much closer, too close for comfort. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Captain Zoral Jax stood in front of the wide bay windows of the Serenity, his starship, looking out over the barren landscape of the moon-sized asteroid. The planet-sized dust storms that whirled just beyond the thin atmosphere were a constant reminder of how dangerous the mission had become. His ship was a rusted hulk of a vessel, just scraping by, much like its crew. The Serenity had been sent on a routine deep space mission to retrieve a lost probe, one of the first to venture beyond the galactic boundary. Something had gone wrong. They were now stranded on Kale's Rock, with no communication and no way to get back home. Or at least, that's what Zoral thought as he stared out at the never-ending wasteland. In the cockpit, his crew was trying to get the ship's damaged thrusters working. The crew wasn't a standard team either, just a ragtag collection of survivors and misfits who'd been thrown together by the same circumstances that now held them captive on the asteroid. "Zoral," came a voice through his earpiece. It was Arya, his ship's chief engineer. "I think we're getting a power surge from the thrusters. We might be able to get off this rock sooner than we thought." Zoral let out a low chuckle, his finger tapping the edge of the window. He wasn't quite ready to believe it. "You said that last time, Arya." Arya's voice was slightly strained. "I mean it this time. The issue was with the quantum feedback loop. It's stabilizing now. I think we can actually get out of here." But Zoral wasn't sure. The Serenity had been through a lot of troubles over the years, and this was just one more setback in a long line of near-death experiences. The crew, after all, was known for getting themselves into trouble. Whether it was a food shortage, an alien encounter, or just bad luck, something always went wrong. Arya's optimism, as much as it was appreciated, also served to keep his stress levels up. He had learned, after so many misfires, that sometimes optimism was more of a distraction than a solution. "Are you sure?" Zoral asked, turning away from the window and heading toward the cockpit. "I'm sure." Arya's voice was much more confident this time, though Zoral could hear her fingers flying over the controls. The soft hum of the ship's machinery echoed in the background. "I've recalibrated the thrusters. The power is surging, stable this time. We could be out of here in a couple of hours." "Well, let's make sure it's stable before we celebrate," Zoral replied, his brow furrowing. As he walked into the cockpit, he was greeted by the sight of his crew. They were a strange bunch, to say the least. Sergeant Knox was at the comms console, typing in commands with the intensity of a person who'd seen more combat than anyone should have. Her sharp, black eyes scanned the interface for any signs of interference. "I hope this works," she muttered under her breath. "We don't have much time. That storm's heading right toward us." Zoral nodded. "We're not going to be stuck here forever. Arya says the thrusters are good to go." Sergeant Knox raised an eyebrow, glancing at the other members of the crew. In the back corner, Tech Specialist Rill, a half-robotic mechanic, was busy tinkering with a piece of hardware. His wiry arms moved swiftly, his digital eyes flickering as he adjusted the system's settings. "You're telling me you think we're actually going to get out of here?" "I'm betting on this being another dead end." Zoral paused for a moment, watching the crew working tirelessly. He didn't want to be the one to break their spirits, but there was a sinking feeling in his gut that told him this wasn't going to be an easy escape. Every time they tried to fix something, it seemed to break again. A sudden beep from the console brought his attention back to Knox, who was staring at the readings with growing concern. "We've got a problem," she said. Zoral's heart skipped. "What is it?" "The system's getting interference from something, or someone. It's messing with the communication relay." Arya's voice cut through the tension. "This could be bad. We're losing power. Those surges from the thrusters are unstable after all." Zoral's mind raced. Every minute counted. They were going to be stuck on Kale's Rock if they didn't figure this out, but he had no idea what could be causing the interference. He looked back at Knox, who had already switched to another monitor. "There it is again," she muttered, her fingers flying over the console. "It's like someone, or something, is interfering with our systems." Zoro glanced out the cockpit window, feeling the weight of the moment pressing on his chest. The comm was too still. He knew that feeling well. It was a bad omen. And that was when they saw it. Just beyond the asteroid shadow, floating in space like a ghost from some long-forgotten era, was a colossal ship, dark, metallic, ancient. Its form was barely discernible in the dim light of Kale's rock, but the shape was unmistakable. Zoro's breath caught. "What the hell is that?" Nox, her face pale, turned to him, her voice full of disbelief. "It's an Ophirian vessel." "Ophirian?" Zoro repeated, his mind racing. The Ophirians were one of the oldest and most mysterious races in the galaxy, known for their incredible technological advances, and their complete absence from modern space. No one had seen an Ophirian ship in centuries. The silence in the cockpit was deafening. The crew stared at the ship, unable to believe what they were seeing. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then, the Ophirian ship began to move. "Should we run?" Nox asked. Zoro stood frozen in thought. If the Ophirians were still around, it was a game-changer. No one had ever dared approach their ships, no one had ever survived the attempt. And here they were, on Kale's rock, stuck in the middle of nowhere, facing a relic from a forgotten era. He couldn't just run without understanding what this meant for them. Before he could answer, the ship's exterior lit up, a strange and eerie glow that sent a shiver down his spine. The color was not anything he recognized, not from any species in the galaxy. It pulsed and flickered, as if the ship itself was alive. "Everyone, stay alert," Zoro said, his voice low and steady. He didn't have the luxury of panic. "We need to figure out why they're here, and if they're hostile. Rill, get to the weapons control." The crew sprang into action, their feet moving with a practiced sense of urgency, despite the uncertainty that hung in the air. The ship was closer now, its presence looming like some kind of dark prophecy, drawing them in. And then, as if it had been waiting for them, the Ophirian ship sent out a signal, a burst of energy that rippled through their systems, jamming their communications and locking the Serenity into place. No escape. Zoro's eyes hardened. Whatever was coming next, they were in it now. The Ophirian ship loomed closer, its dark mass filling the viewports of the Serenity like some forgotten shadow from a distant nightmare. Zoro's heart beat faster with each second that passed, the eerie silence of the cockpit only broken by the low hum of their ship's failing systems. The crew had been tense ever since the ship appeared, but now, as their comms went dead and the Ophirian ship's presence enveloped them, the anxiety had shifted to full-on fear. "Do we have any comms?" Nox asked, her voice taut as she frantically tapped at her console, trying to regain some control over their systems. Arya's voice came in from behind Zoro, her tone equally strained. "None. Whatever that ship did, it's taken over our comms and most of our power systems. I can't even track where the energy is coming from. It's like it's draining us on purpose." Zoro's eyes narrowed as he watched the strange, shifting glow from the Ophirian ship. It wasn't like anything he'd ever seen. The ship didn't just move, it seemed to exist outside normal space-time, bending and rippling in ways that felt unnatural, as if it were not part of their reality. There was no trace of conventional engines, no thrusters visible, no signs of propulsion at all. It just was. "What are they doing?" Zoro asked aloud, more to himself than anyone else. "What do they want with us?" Nox turned toward him, her face grim. "I don't know, but we're stuck here for now. Without comms, we can't even call for help." Rill, who had been sitting in the corner of the cockpit, fiddling with a multi-tool, finally looked up. "We could try to break free manually, Captain. I mean, if you want to get technical about it, I could reroute the power to our maneuvering thrusters and—" Zoro didn't let him finish. "We're not going to outrun an Ophirian ship, Rill. We need to understand what they're doing first." The half-cyborg mechanic muttered something under his breath and returned to his tools, clearly not thrilled by the lack of action. Zoral's mind was working quickly. If the Etherians were making an effort to isolate them, that likely meant they weren't interested in annihilation, at least, not yet. They could have wiped them out in an instant, but instead, they were being studied. And that could be even worse. Arya, any chance you can override the systems from inside? Zoral asked, his voice firm. Arya shook her head, walking up beside him, a frustrated look on her face. I can't override anything remotely. The interference is too strong. It's like they've embedded something into our ship's core systems, taking over the entire network. The crew was working furiously, trying to understand what was happening, but Zoral knew that all their efforts were meaningless unless they figured out how to break free from the ship's control. He'd seen enough to know that when you were up against something older and more advanced than you, you needed to adapt quickly, or be destroyed. It was that simple. But adapting in this case felt nearly impossible. The Etherians weren't just technologically superior, they were a nearly mythical race, with abilities that no one fully understood. And now they had their eyes on Zoral's ship. A sudden noise cut through the tense atmosphere, a grinding, metallic sound that made everyone jump. Zoral's heart leapt into his throat as he turned to face the viewport again. The Etherian ship's exterior shimmered, as if reality itself was bending around it. Then came the loudest, most jarring sound, like the deep, guttural growl of some ancient beast. It was a noise that seemed to shake the very fabric of the Serenity. Zoral's eyes widened as a strange, holographic projection burst from the Etherian ship, filling the entire view of space before them. For a long moment, nothing happened. The projection was a cloud of shifting data, almost abstract in form. It was like looking into a fog of symbols and patterns, too intricate to decipher, yet powerful in its presence. Zoral squinted, his mind racing. What in the stars is that? Before anyone could answer, the data cloud began to shape itself into something more recognizable, a figure, humanoid in shape, though its outline was jagged and unclear. It flickered, like a mirage, yet seemed to pulse with intelligence. The figure's eyes, glowing with an unsettling green light, locked directly onto Zoral's, and for a split second, he felt as though the creature, if it even was one, was staring directly into his soul. He didn't know how to describe the sensation. It was more than just a threat, it felt like the entity was reading him, understanding him, taking in everything he had ever thought, everything he had ever been. Don't move, Nox whispered, her voice barely audible. Whatever that is, it's aware of us. Zoral swallowed hard, staring at the figure in the projection. It was so alien, so utterly beyond his understanding, that it sent chills down his spine. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get away from whatever that was, but he held his ground. What does it want? Arya asked, her voice thick with fear. The figure in the projection shifted again. Then, with a shocking clarity, a voice filled the cockpit. It was soft at first, like a whisper, but it quickly grew louder, more commanding. Humans. Zoral's blood ran cold. How did it? Arya started to say, but she fell silent, unable to finish the sentence. The figure continued, its voice growing more distinct, each syllable dripping with an unsettling resonance that seemed to vibrate the very air. You ask, what is the worst that could happen? It intoned, and Zoral felt his muscles tense. It was speaking to them, not just to him, but to everyone. What you fail to understand is that you, like all others before you, are nothing but a fleeting thought in the vastness of the universe. You are a blip in time, an insignificant anomaly. Zoral stood frozen, his hand gripping the console, eyes locked on the projection. He had been in dangerous situations before, had faced threats of all kinds. But nothing, compared to this. The projection flickered again, the figure's image distorting as though it was being transmitted from the deepest recesses of space. It seemed to stretch out into infinity, its gaze never leaving Zoral. The worst that could happen has already begun. You are already in the grip of forces you cannot understand. Zoral's jaw clenched. He refused to let fear take hold, not now, not when his crew depended on him. We won't go down without a fight, he muttered, mostly to himself. But his words hung in the air like empty promises, and as the strange, eerie figure pulsed one last time, he couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that something far greater than they could ever hope to comprehend was about to unfold. And they were about to be caught in the middle of it. The tension in the Serenity's cockpit was unbearable. The strange, ghostly projection from the Ophirian ship was gone, but its words continued to echo in Zoral's mind. The worst that could happen has already begun. It was as if the figure had seen into their very souls, reading their fears, their doubts, and now they were prisoners in a cosmic game they didn't understand. Nox was the first to break the silence. "So, what now? Do we just sit here and wait for them to finish whatever it is they're doing?" Zoral didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the viewport, watching the Ophirian ship, which now hovered silently, its glowing form pulsing intermittently. It was too perfect, too still, it wasn't moving in any conventional sense, and that unnerved him even more. If the Ophirians were going to attack, it seemed as though they were waiting for something. Arya spoke up next, her voice shaky. "We can't just sit here, Captain. I need to know what's happening. We've already lost the comms, but maybe I can." Suddenly, the whole ship shook violently, a deep, thunderous tremor that rattled the crew. Alarms screamed across the Serenity, lights flickering as systems faltered. Zoral gripped the edge of the console, instinctively shielding his crew from the sudden surge of power. "Arya," he shouted over the noise. "What the hell was that?" "It's coming from the Ophirian ship." Arya gasped, her hands scrambling over her control panel. "They've sent a wave through our systems, destabilizing our energy core." Zoral's heart skipped a beat. "What do we do?" "Try to stabilize the core." Arya replied, urgency in her voice. "I can't get the power levels back to normal, but if I don't at least stabilize the energy feedback, we'll be dead in minutes." Zoral didn't need to hear anything else. He knew their survival hinged on Arya's expertise, but there was a catch: she couldn't do it alone. He turned to Nox and Rill. "Nox, I need you to assist Arya with the energy stabilization. Rill, we're going to need weapons, now." Rill's robotic limbs clicked into motion as he turned toward the weapons systems. "On it, Captain. I've got an idea. If I reroute the power grid, I might be able to activate the disruptors. It'll be risky, but it might give us some cover." "We don't have time for might," Zoral barked, his voice steely. "Do it. Now." As Nox and Arya scrambled to stabilize the ship's failing systems, Zoral could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His crew was capable, but even they had their limits. If the Ophirians were doing what he feared, there might not be a way to survive this. They needed to break free of their control, now. The ship shook again, this time much harder, and this time, it wasn't just a tremor. It felt like the Serenity's hull was being pulled apart from the inside. Zoral could hear the groans of the structure, the creaking of metal under stress. "Captain," Arya's voice was strained, her hands flying over the console, "I'm losing the core. It's about to go critical." Zoral felt his blood run cold. "How long do we have?" 2 minutes. Maybe less. 2 minutes. That was all they had. Zoral knew he had to make a decision. They couldn't wait for a miracle. The Ophirians were either trying to kill them, or worse, analyze them, in ways they could not even begin to understand. If they didn't act now, they'd be stuck here, powerless, a mere experiment in the hands of an ancient species. Zoral turned toward Nox, his face determined. "We need to break their hold on us. You're the one who can make this happen." Nox blinked, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "I need you to hack the Ophirian ship," Zoral said, as though the words came naturally. "Find a way to reverse their signal and disable whatever control they have over us. Whatever they're using to siphon power and scramble our systems, we turn it against them." For a moment, Nox stared at him, wide-eyed, as if trying to process the insane request. But Zoral didn't give her time to question it. "Can you do it?" he demanded. Nox swallowed, her pulse quickening, but a determined glint appeared in her eyes. "I've been trained to fight against all kinds of tech, but this is next level." If they've got something this advanced, it's not going to be easy. Zyx'tal turned to Arya. How's the core? I've got it under control, Arya said, but there was no certainty in her voice. I'm stabilizing it, but it's going to take every ounce of energy we have just to keep it from detonating. You don't have much time. Zyx'tal nodded grimly. They didn't have the luxury of waiting for a solution to come to them. It was time to take matters into their own hands. We'll make time, Zyx'tal said, his eyes steely. Rill, how's the weapons system? Rill was already at his station, his mechanical fingers working furiously at the console. Weapons online in 30 seconds, Captain. Disruptors are ready to fire. We'll have to take out their systems manually, there's no way we'll hit the ship directly. Zyx'tal felt a surge of adrenaline. Good. Nox, get ready to hack that ship. You're our key to survival. Nox nodded, her jaw clenched. I'll try. But if I fail? We don't fail, Zyx'tal cut in, his voice firm, unwavering. We adapt. We survive. As Rill counted down to the weapons systems going live, Zyx'tal's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the pressure mounting with every passing second. The Ophirian ship hovered like an impenetrable fortress, its silent presence mocking them as the Serenity creaked and groaned under the strain. Time was slipping away, but they had one advantage, they weren't giving up. Suddenly, Nox's fingers flew over her console, eyes locked on the data she was deciphering. I'm in. It's a convoluted system. They've got layers upon layers of encryption, whoever designed this knows what they're doing. Zyx'tal held his breath, watching as Nox worked. If they couldn't break through now, all would be lost. Come on, Nox, Zyx'tal muttered under his breath. The seconds felt like hours as the crew worked furiously. Rill's voice broke the silence. Disruptors online. We can fire at will. Wait for my signal, Zyx'tal said, his eyes still locked on Nox. The room held its breath as Nox tapped a final command, and the screen blinked. Then, a series of feedback alarms sounded across the cockpit. I'm in. Nox shouted, her voice tinged with disbelief. I'm in. I've reversed their signal. It's backfiring on them. The Serenity's lights flickered once more, but this time, it was a sign of their victory. The Ophirian ship's eerie glow dimmed. Fire, Zyx'tal commanded. Rill didn't hesitate. The disruptors fired with a low hum, their energy bursts rippling through space toward the Ophirian vessel. As the beams struck, the once imposing ship began to shimmer and distort, like a phantom vanishing into thin air. And then, silence. The Ophirian ship had disappeared. Zyx'tal exhaled sharply, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. They had survived. For now. As the crew stood in stunned silence, Arya spoke, her voice barely a whisper. We did it. Zyx'tal turned to her, the ghost of a smile crossing his face. We adapt. We survive. But in the pit of his stomach, a nagging feeling remained, one he couldn't shake. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The Ophirians had shown their hand, but Zyx'tal knew this encounter was only the beginning of something far more complex and dangerous. And if they were going to make it out alive, they had to be ready for whatever came next. The quiet hum of the Serenity's engines seemed to mock the chaos that had just passed. Zyx'tal sat in the captain's chair, staring out into the endless expanse of space. The Ophirian ship, that ship, was gone. But Zyx'tal wasn't fooled. Their victory had been a fleeting moment of triumph, and the weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on his mind. They had only scratched the surface of something far larger, far darker. We're alive, Nox said, her voice tinged with disbelief as she stood beside Arya, who was monitoring the stabilization of the ship's systems. But for how long? Zyx'tal turned to face her, his expression unwavering. Long enough to figure out what the hell just happened and what we do next. That ship, those beings, they're out there. And they won't stop coming until they get what they want. Rill entered the cockpit, wiping grease from his hands, his face unreadable. The ship's systems are back online. I did a full scan, though, and we haven't picked up any other ships nearby. That Ophirian ship didn't leave a trace. Good, Zyx'tal said. Let's keep it that way. We don't need to draw attention. We need answers, Captain, Nox replied, her arms crossed. What are they after? Why us? Zyx'tal stared at the viewport again. The cold expanse of space stretched out before them, vast and indifferent. I don't know. But whatever it is, I don't think it's going to end with this encounter. We've barely even seen the tip of the iceberg. Arya finally looked up from her console. The core's stable now, but it's going to take a while to fully recalibrate. The damage from that power drain, it's bad. We might not be able to make any long jumps until I get everything back in order. Zyx'tal nodded, his mind already racing. We'll deal with that later. For now, we need to figure out what the Ophirians want, and fast. Suddenly, a soft beep interrupted the tense silence, and a new alert popped up on the communications panel. Zyx'tal's eyes narrowed as he read the data. Captain, you need to see this, Arya said, urgency creeping into her voice. Zyx'tal stood and walked over to her station, leaning in to look at the display. What he saw made his stomach drop. A single, encrypted transmission. It wasn't a message, they had no idea what it was. But it was a signature, a familiar, unmistakable one. The same one they had just experienced from the Ophirian ship. Zyx'tal's blood ran cold. They're trying to contact us again. Nox was at the console now, her fingers flying over the keys. I'm tracing it. Hold on. The transmission continued, a barrage of incomprehensible data flooding their systems, then finally settling into something coherent. Words began to form, written in a script that at first glance seemed completely alien. But Zyx'tal knew something instinctively, this was a message. Nox paused her work, her eyes widening in disbelief. Wait a second. It's not just a message. It's an invitation. Zyx'tal raised an eyebrow. An invitation? Nox shot him a look. Yeah. It's challenging us. It says, we have watched you, human. You are not as insignificant as we first thought. We invite you to witness the true nature of the universe. But know this, the cost is high, and the consequences, uncharted. There was a long pause as Zyx'tal processed the words. His crew looked at each other, exchanging uncertain glances. This was no longer just about survival, it was something far bigger than any of them had anticipated. Arya spoke up, her voice quieter now. It's a test, Zyx'tal. They're watching us. This whole thing has been some kind of evaluation. Zyx'tal clenched his fists. A test? For what? I don't know, Arya said. But they're treating us like we're not just a species to be wiped out. We're a puzzle. They've got a plan, and it's bigger than we are. Rill crossed his arms, clearly unsettled. We're talking about an ancient species that can manipulate time and space. We've barely survived an encounter with them, and now they want to invite us into their world? It doesn't sound like a friendly gesture. Zyx'tal looked around at his crew. They were all shaken, some more than others, but they all shared the same determination. We don't know what their endgame is. But I'll tell you one thing, we're not going to sit back and let them use us like pawns. If they want to test us, we'll meet that challenge head-on. And if it's the last thing we do, we'll make sure they understand one thing about humanity. Nox raised an eyebrow. What's that? Zyx'tal's gaze turned steely, and he met each of their eyes in turn. That we survive. No matter what they throw at us. We've made it this far, and we're not backing down now. The crew stood in silence, each of them processing the weight of Zyx'tal's words. It wasn't just about them anymore, it was about humanity's place in the universe, about proving to the Ophirians, to every alien species, that they weren't going to be pushed around. Arya spoke again, her voice resolute. I'll begin decrypting the message. If they're inviting us into whatever this is, we need to be ready. Zyx'tal nodded. We'll be ready. But we need to make sure that when we step into their world, we're not just pawns in their game. If they want to see what humans can do, then they'll learn exactly why we're not as insignificant as they think. Rill's mechanical arms clicked together in a determined gesture. Just tell me when and where, Captain. I'll make sure we've got the firepower we need. Zor-El smiled grimly. It won't be about firepower this time. We need to think beyond their tech, beyond their power. We need to think like humans. The Etherians think they've got all the answers. Let's prove them wrong. As the crew began preparing for whatever would come next, Zor-El couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was far from over. It was only the beginning of a far greater challenge. But what made his heart pound wasn't just the stakes, it was the thought that they might just have a chance. For the first time in a long while, Zor-El felt something unexpected stir within him, a sense of exhilaration. This wasn't just about surviving. It was about showing the universe what humanity was capable of. The Etherians may have underestimated them, but Zor-El wasn't about to let that stand. All right, crew, Zor-El said, his voice rising with renewed determination. Let's show the universe why they shouldn't mess with humanity. And as the Serenity's engines roared back to life, the crew prepared for what was sure to be their greatest challenge yet. They had survived the Etherians once, now it was time to face them on their own terms.